few years ago, when I was still in Utah, I was invited to speak to an undergraduate law class on how the Torah influenced the Constitution. I have to say, it is not my area of expertise, but I was interested in the topic anyway. So after making my presentation, I'd been there for maybe an hour, and there was time for some Q&A. And one young woman raised her hand and said, "I've never met anyone before who supports gun control. Can you explain your perspective?" And I was struck by two things. One, she'd never met anybody who had an opposing view from her. And two, the respect with which she asked the question. So I talked to her about the balance between individual freedoms and communal responsibility. But above and beyond any answer I could give her, I was so impressed that she had asked. It is a kind of vulnerability and trust to say to someone, "I am open to hearing your side." And I think one of the reasons that I was so impressed is that I've been struck of late by people shouting down others who disagree with them, unwilling to open their minds, to open their ears to a different perspective. But apparently, this is not necessarily a new phenomenon. In 1985, Neil Postman, in Amusing Ourselves to Death, Public Discourse in the Age of Show Business, said, "In America, everyone is entitled to an opinion, and it is certainly useful to have a few when the pollster shows up. It is probably more accurate to call them emotions rather than opinions, which would account for the fact that they change, for his opinion, from week to week. What is happening here is that the television is altering the meaning of being informed by creating a species of information that might properly be called disinformation. And disinformation does not mean false information, or at least then it didn't. It means misleading information, misplaced, irrelevant, fragmented, or superficial information. Information that creates the illusion of knowing something, but which in fact leads one away from knowing. In saying this, I do not mean to imply that television news deliberately aims to deprive Americans of a coherent, contextual understanding of their world. I mean to say that when news is packaged as entertainment, that it is the inevitable result. And in saying that the television news entertains but does not inform, I am saying something far more serious than that we are deprived of authentic information. I am saying that we are losing our sense of what it means to be well-informed. Ignorance is always correctable, but what shall we do if we take ignorance to be knowledge? And what has happened, it seems to me, since 1985, is that we have taken that ignorance, entrenched it within ourselves as knowledge, and then decided that the best way to stay contained within our ignorance is to shout it as loudly as we can and to block out any contention, any different opinions. And it seems the less we know, the louder we get, and we divide into sides. Zaid Jilani and Jeremy Adams Smith write in The Greater Good from Berkeley, "Polarization is not the same as disagreement about how to solve public policy problems, which is healthy and natural in a democracy. Polarization is about more than just having a different opinion than your neighbor about certain issues. It occurs when we refuse to live next to a neighbor who doesn't share our politics, or when we won't send our children to a racially integrated school. The force that empowers polarization is tribalism, clustering ourselves into groups that compete against each other in a zero-sum game where negotiation and compromise are perceived as betrayal, whether those groups are political, racial, economic, religious, gender, or generational." And so it seems to me that is the combination of misinformation and the necessity of being unwilling to hear other information that entrenches us. And so I want to invite us to consider two alternatives: the power of and tzimtzum. So the power of and makes its presence known in Pirkei Avot, which I quoted yesterday, but is full of beautiful, beautiful information. This is Pirkei Avot 5:17. It says, Kol machlochet shehi l'shem shamayim sofa lehitkayem. Every dispute that is for the sake of heaven, in the end, will endure. But one that is not for the sake of heaven will not endure. Which is the controversy that is for the sake of heaven? Such was the controversy of Hillel and Shammai. And what is the controversy that is not for the sake of heaven? Such was the controversy of Korach and his congregation. So we have to then think about what is the controversy of Hillel and Shammai? Well, they were two opposing academies, and in Masechet Eruvin in the Talmud, it says, for 3 years, the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai argued. The one said the halacha is like us. The Jewish law agrees with us. And the other said the halacha is like us. A heavenly voice spoke. Elu ve'elu, divarim Elohim chayim. These and these are the words of the living God. And the halacha sides with the house of Hillel. How is it possible that the heavenly voice can agree with both sides, but side with the voice of Hillel? A question was raised. Since the heavenly voice declared both these and these are the living God, why was the halacha established to follow the opinion of Hillel and not Shammai? It is because the students of Hillel were kind and gracious. They taught their own ideas as well as the ideas from the students of Shammai. Not only for this reason, but they went so far as to teach Shammai's opinions first. They not only knew the opposition, but they treated it with respect. It is hard sometimes to hear something that is fundamentally flawed and fundamentally wrong, and to embrace it as well. And I want to make a distinction between embracing falsehood and embracing the people who are misled into falsehood. So often what we do is we condemn people, which if we go back to the controversy of Korach and his congregation, what Korach did was he actually took a truth. Are we not all a holy people? Are we not a people of priests? And he said to Moses, what's so great about you? How come you get to be the one who speaks up? You get to be the one whose words get heard. And fundamentally what he was doing is he was speaking against God. And what he was doing, again, was not attacking a policy or a position. He was attacking a person. And I think that one of the distinctions that we have to make is that we can disagree with people and still understand that they are people. By shouting down their ideas, we don't move our ideas further. What we do is we build walls. The way that we learn, and indeed the way that we convince, is through conversation. We are much more apt to be convinced by people we know and trust than by people who scream at us, yell at us, troll us. So the question of this woman in Utah came to me not at the synagogue. It came in her classroom, and it didn't come at the beginning of the class. It came at the end, after we had already established rules of conversation. So there must be, then, rules of conversation. Mortimer Adler, in a book called How to Read a Book, says ordinary conversations between persons who confront each other are good only when they are carried on civilly. We are not merely thinking of civilities according to the conventions of social politeness. Such conventions are not really important. What is important is that there is an intellectual etiquette to be observed. Without it, conversation is bickering rather than profitable communication. We are assuming here, of course, that the conversation is about a serious matter on which men can agree or disagree, and then it becomes important that they conduct themselves well. Otherwise, there is no profit in the enterprise. The profit in good conversation is something learned. So when we enter into conversation, first, we have to make sure that it's a conversation worth having. Second, we have to follow the rules of conversation. And third, we must respect the person with whom we are in conversation. And so I want us to think about what it means, not to try to convince someone else in our conversation, but to try to embrace the and. So often we find ourselves at either side of a pole. In fact, I have been told when taking a position and then agreeing with someone else's position, you can't have it both ways. And it is something that we say, that is said often in our society. Either you are with me or you are against me. And my friends, I protest. I don't think it's true. I think we need to embrace the yes and rather than the no but. There is place for differing ideas. And the way that we come to that is through something called tzimtzum. Tzimtzum is a Kabbalistic notion. It has to do with the creation of the world, and the Godhead contracts its essence, so to speak, by retreating from himself into himself. Taking up less space, God makes room for creation in order to create an empty region. Not every space needs to be filled, and certainly it doesn't need to be filled by us. Rabbi Eugene Borowitz, Zichrono Livracha, argues that the appeal of this Kabbalistic, Lurianic interpretation of creation story is that it provides dynamic roles for humans as co-creators with God. When God pulls back, then we can take on the mitzvah, the spiritual obligation of repairing the world. And if it is true with God, how much the more so is it true with people? If we take up all of the space, what room is there for other people? We can be right all the time if we're alone. But we don't live alone. We live in community. We have to live in community. And that means that we must, in the words of Musar, take up no more than my place and no less than my space. Right? We are entitled to our dignity, to our opinions, and so is everyone else. And even when we know they are wrong, they are foolish, they must be crazy, they are made in the image of God. And that changes the way that we have our discourse. They can be wrong and still be deserving of life. They can be wrong and still be deserving of respect. The policies, the ideas we can contend with. Maybe if we all take a step back, there will be room for the discourse and room for the and. We must make space, even for those we disagree with. We must take up space when their ideas threaten other people. And that, my friends, is a gvul, it is a boundary. But up until that boundary, let us make room for each other. Let us practice humility. Let us ask the question, not in order to prove our point, but in order to learn, embracing the and practicing tzimtzum.